we have Charu Mishra, the world's leading expert on snow leopards and Executive Director of the Snow Leopard Trust.
Thank you. One of the absolute joys of my work is to be able to experience sites like this. Now, I had the privilege of meeting this snow leopard and her two cubs earlier this year in the high Himalayas in a place called Spiti Valley. And this family is actually part of a wonderful story of conservation led by the region's local and indigenous communities, who 25 years ago used to view the species as a pest. Now, today they view it as an important resource and a natural heritage to be protected and cherished. That's a story for another time. Now, over the last 2 decades or so, I believe we have made significant progress in snow leopard conservation. But I have to admit that not everywhere is a happy story like it is in Spiti Valley. Now, for instance, it's estimated that on average, in the high mountains of Asia, every day, snow leopards get killed somewhere. And typically, their body parts are traded. Now, fortunately, all indications seem to suggest that the illegal trade in snow leopard body parts is largely supply-driven and not driven by a strong demand from the markets. So it therefore appears that, so in other words, essentially that if there's not a strong market demand, but when a snow leopard gets killed, its body parts typically find a market. So given this situation, what's the right thing to do? Now clearly, since the market demand does not appear to be very strong, it perhaps does not require us to focus too much on the markets, but instead, it would appear that we need to strengthen law enforcement to arrest and prosecute the poachers. And that appears to be the straightforward and right thing to do. But is it? And to find out, we need to look at the typical context within which a snow leopard gets killed a little more closely. Now, snow leopard populations depend on populations of wild mountain ungulates, the wild herbivores. But when they have a chance, snow leopards also kill livestock. Now, that same livestock is a critically important resource for the people living in high Asia. So, and when a livestock gets killed, such as a yak, it can be a significant economic setback for the family, because an adult yak, for example, can cost anywhere between 400 to 800 pounds, which is a significant amount for the farmer. So, given this situation, now we have to ask again, should we still go ahead and arrest and prosecute the poacher? Perhaps we should, because it is a legal issue after all, and snow leopards are accorded the highest levels of protection in all countries that they occur in. But at the same time, it's also an act of desperation, killing of a snow leopard. So it's really hard to decide what the right thing to do is. So irrespective of what we do or not do with the poacher, what's clear is that we need to work with these communities to help them better protect their livestock, to help them secure their livelihoods, and to create mechanisms where their economic losses can be offset when actually snow leopards do kill their livestock. And that's something that we do, and we actually find it very useful. But the question is that enough? Now, as a scientist and as a conservationist, the act of a snow leopard killing a yak, for me, is essentially a data point that one can do something with. Now, with enough such data points, you begin to actually understand the patterns and extent of livestock predation, and then you use that knowledge to actually design and co-create conservation and conflict management programs with the communities, with the affected communities. And again, that's something that we do, and it is helpful. But like I said, to me, a dead yak is essentially a point, is a number in space and time. But I think it's important to also ask what a dead yak means for this woman. Now, she had been looking after this yak, taking care of it, from even before it was born, because she was taking care of the mother. She helped deliver the calf when it was born. Now, day after day, she actually took care of this yak and ensured its survival. Now, this yak grew up to become an important part of her family's assets and support systems. Now, the same yak got killed not very far away from her home. Now, what I'd like you to do is to imagine kind of yourself in her position for just a moment. Now, in her case, it was a yak. Imagine that in my case, or in your case, it's your pet animal. Now, take a moment. Close your eyes if that helps you, and put yourself in her position. Now you tell me, can any amount of financial compensation actually offset the feelings of violation, injustice, and emotional trauma that she must be going through? It cannot. So once again, we have this dilemma about what is the right thing to do. Maybe science can show us the way. So our collaring and tracking research on snow leopards now establishes very clearly that male snow leopards kill disproportionately more livestock compared to females. So one of the ways to reduce the level of livestock predation, then perhaps, is to start managing snow leopard populations by removing a certain proportion of the males from the population. And that perhaps will help bring down the extent of livestock predation disproportionately. Now the question is, are we okay sacrificing a few individual snow leopards for the larger good of the snow leopard population? I don't know. Science seems to indicate that it's something that we should experiment with, but also we need to keep in mind that this beautiful and awe-inspiring animal is also a sentient being, just like you and I are. So once again, what is the right thing to do? I don't know, but I believe that it's critically important for us as conservationists to constantly challenge ourselves with these uncomfortable questions about the species that we are trying to protect. Especially because when it comes to humans, we never consider sacrificing a few humans for the larger good of the human species. And so it's really a dilemma. And why don't we do this in the case of humans? Because in the case of humans, we try to hold ourselves morally accountable as individuals, as societies, and as nations, right? Or at least so we believe. But do we actually? And to answer that, I'd like to you to consider a couple of examples from the history of conservation through a moral perspective. Now let's start with the oldest national park in the world, Yellowstone. Now, native communities had been using those lands for at least 11,000 years. Yet, in 1872, when the Yellowstone National Park was created, the region's Shoshone Indian group called the Tukudeka, who also called the mountain sheep eaters, perhaps because of their dependence on the bighorn sheep, the region's bighorn sheep. They, as well as the other communities using those lands, were evicted, and the army was deployed. A century prior to the establishment of Yellowstone, on another continent, another indigenous people called the Maasai had moved into a region and established themselves into a region they called the Serengeti. And unlike the Tukudeka, the Maasai actually were not dependent on wild meat. They subsisted completely on their livestock. Now, the region's wildlife coexisted with the Maasai for the next 200 years. In 1940, an equally famous national park was, protected area was created here, the Serengeti, on the backs of 2 centuries of coexistence between the Maasai and the region's wildlife. And yet, within the next 20 years, the Maasai had been completely evicted from those lands. And now it's easy to dismiss these couple of examples as belonging to the past, but even today, 167,000 Maasai are facing violent evictions from the lands that they are using to make space for protected areas and conservancies. And ironically, some of them are being evicted from areas that they actually moved into when they were displaced from the Serengeti region. So, it's our own actions are often actually morally quite questionable. Now, one last time this evening, I'm going to ask, what then is the right thing to do? Now, today, at this 30th anniversary of the wonderful Whitley Fund for Nature, many of us here, we are collectively launching the Ethical Conservation Alliance with its mission to promote ethical conservation worldwide, to create a movement in ethical conservation. Through trainings, policy engagement, public awareness, and international cooperation, our goal is to transform the way conservation is practiced across the world's lands and oceans by making it more ethical. And what do we mean by ethical conservation? Ethical conservation is an approach where we commit ourselves to moral progress in the way we view and treat both wildlife and humans in conservation. Ethical conservation involves protecting biodiversity while promoting social justice and empowering the local and indigenous communities who've been typically the victims of conservation to become its most important torchbearers and beneficiaries. And ladies and gentlemen, ethical conservation requires all of us to commit to trying to do what is morally the right thing to do. Thank you very much.